having me back on your platform. I always appreciate the invitation. And today's session will be about composting for a healthier garden. And this is something I've been composting for years now. And it is really simple and easy, but it has a lot of benefits to the garden. So we'll be talking about that and looking at that as we go along. This is the outline for the presentation. We're going to have a brief introduction. Then we're going to talk about what compost is. We're going to look at the benefits, the various types of composting, and then we're going to go into the actual composting techniques. After that, we'll look at the ways that you can use your finished compost, and I'll share some tips for composting. I'll also save some time at the end for questions and answers. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and then I'll also be taking questions at the end of the presentation. So just as an introduction, I have the scripture there from Genesis chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. And it says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed." Genesis chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. And there's a lot in that scripture that to me, it brings to mind composting. You see, there it talks about man was made from the dust of the earth. And I can, you know, argue that that dust contains some of the same things, some of the same aspects that we'll be working with when we're making compost. It talks about the breath of life that God gave to man, and then we became a living soul. And God put us in a garden. That's something that we've talked about in the past about how important the garden is. And we're going to circle back to this scripture as we get to the end of the presentation. The next verse, the next quote, that's from the book Country Living by Ellen White. And it says, "The earth has blessings hidden in her depths for those who have the courage and will and perseverance to gather her treasures." And to me, compost is one of those treasures that are hidden, everything that we need to make compost. And then that supports the garden that we use to grow food for our health, for our survival. That's something that we can utilize. Often when people think about composting and fertilizing and plants, they focus on the plants rather than the soil. That's something that today I hope that you'll see that, we should look more towards plants need or they're within the soil. People worry about fertilizers, and often there's no shortage of nutrients and fertilizers within the soil, but it's the thing that we're missing is the way to make those nutrients and those ingredients available to the plants. And that's exactly what compost does. So here's a question. What is compost? And as I just mentioned, compost really isn't a fertilizer, even though that's what people mainly think about when they think about compost. They think it's a plant fertilizer, but it really is not. It's a nutrient-rich material derived from organic matter. Organic matter is what we use to create compost. We're going to be learning exactly how to create compost as we go along. It's also known as black gold. That's one of the things that people refer to compost as. And for a while now, going back to organic gardening, people have been aware of the importance of compost and how valuable it is. And it's not just something that we just take from the soil. It's just not there in the ground. It's something that we create. And in order to create it, we utilize these microorganisms that are within the earth, within the soil. And that's what actually creates it. We are able to use that to take organic matter and turn that into the compost that we're going to be using. Some of the things that are also necessary in addition to the microorganisms, we'll use heat, we'll use oxygen, and we'll use other organisms, larger organisms, and insects and animals that also play a role in creating compost. When you look at compost after it's finished, after you're finished making the compost, it looks like a rich garden soil. That's the appearance that it has. And this slide, those are worm castings, looks very similar to compost. And I just had that picture to kind of give you an idea of what compost should look like after you're done making compost. Some of the benefits of composting, there are a lot of benefits. First of all, it can help you to really build your soil. It improves the soil structure and improves the fertility of the soil. Another benefit is that it will help you to retain moisture and reduce the need for irrigation. Just having soil that has a lot of organic matter and it contains the things that are within the compost or the compost itself will help retain moisture. And as a result, you won't need to water your garden as often. And even when you do receive rain and irrigation, it's going to hold that moisture longer than it would if you didn't have compost or that organic matter within the soil. It also will save money because as you're using compost, that's going to reduce the amount of fertilizers that you need. And also the fact that you'll be able to eliminate, a lot of people rely on chemical fertilizers. So you'll be able to do away with those and just not applying chemicals to your garden, to your soil. That's going to do a lot to promote the health and the productivity of your garden, of the plants that are growing. Another value of using compost is that it reduces the amount of waste that's going to landfills. The things that we're going to be using and turning into compost, if we didn't do that, we'd have to get rid of it. And that would be, garbage and waste, and whether it was leaves or grass clippings, all that would be sent to landfill. And, rather than just have it go and take up space in the landfill, we can utilize that. We can put it to good use and avoid having to send that as a waste product. And it definitely, compost has a positive impact on plant health and the growth of plants. That's something that once you start using it, you'll notice the difference and you'll realize how valuable compost is and how important it is. This is a picture of one of my gardens this was, I think, a couple of years ago. But I use compost and I've been using compost for years now. And ever since I've been on the property where I am, that's the main thing that I use. I have not been adding a lot in the way of fertilizers to the garden. And that's one of the benefits that I mentioned. You can save money by not having to apply these fertilizers every year. You can utilize the compost that you're making yourself. And that will give you vibrant gardens and plants that are healthy and that are abundant and growing quickly. And it's not just vegetable plants. Compost has an impact. So that's something that is not just for growing vegetables. Any plant that you're raising in your garden will benefit from the use of compost. Another example are fruit trees. They do really well. And one of the really great things about compost with fruit trees is you don't even have to get it down to the root zone of the fruit tree. You can just mulch around the base of the tree, and that you'll get the benefits of compost just by having the mulch on the ground around the fruit trees. Another place where compost is very useful is if you're growing things in containers. All of the pictures on these slides are from plants that are growing in containers. And often, if you're growing plants in containers and you're using the same container year after year, you have to fertilize it. And over time, that soil that's in those containers is going to degrade. You're going to have to do something to revitalize that soil. And compost is something that you can do to revitalize and put life back into that soil. And it doesn't take much, just a little bit of compost makes a huge difference. Then there are certain plants in particular that show really noticeable results just by having compost applied. Ginger is one of those plants that really benefits from the application of compost. Ginger and as well as turmeric, they both are noted that when you get those microorganisms, that soil life to these plants, they really respond well. Now we're going to cover the various types of compost. Some we're going to go into detail in the processes to create them, and some we're just going to touch on. We're starting here with backyard composting. And when I say backyard composting, I'm referring to just composting on a smaller scale. And in most cases, you're going to be using bins or just compost piles. And sometimes you'll see people that get the like tumblers that they use that you can put your organic matter in and you can spin them or turn them. And that helps to encourage the organic matter to decompose and break down. Another option is called sheet or pit composting. We're going to talk about this a little bit. Vermicomposting, that's something that's become one of my favorite ways of composting. And we are going to go over the process for vermicomposting. And it's basically you're using earthworms to compost the organic matter. Bokashi, that's something, and it's not as common, and a lot of people aren't familiar with this style of compost. We aren't going to go into any detail on this, but it's just a different way of composting, and it's vastly different from the composting and the type of compost we're going to be looking at, because there you can see where it says anaerobic process. So you're not using oxygen. Air is an important part of that type of composting. And I've used it a little bit just to experiment with it. And it's not, I really prefer the types of composting we're going to be looking at that do use aerobic processes, that do use the air and the oxygen. But I just want you to know, if you ever hear that term, that's what it's referring to. Then there's larger scale composting. If you're growing, if you're homesteading, if you're farming, we're going to look at ways that you can produce larger quantities of compost as well. Now, this slide shows a picture. This is more along the lines of a backyard type of composting setup. You can see in the middle there that black um, plastic device. That's a composting bin. A lot of the municipalities where I used to live in Pennsylvania, they would give those away to homeowners just to encourage you to compost your yard waste and your kitchen waste, because they recognize that by if the residents were composting that material, it would save them as far as the expenses of waste management, to haul it away, to take it to the landfill. So they would just give these away and also give, training or instruction on how to compost. But it's a small scale. You're not going to make a lot of compost with that, but it will compost a good amount of material. To the left of that, you can see there's just like a wire fencing material. That's one of the things that I really like to use to compost, because it's inexpensive, it's readily available, and you can just make your own, and you can make it various sizes just by, the size, the diameter that you're making. And I just would take the material, and I would just make a circle with it and just use the ends and fold them over to hold it. So you can make that any width that you wanted to. And you can see the height for that. There's probably about a 5 foot high fence there. So you can do a lot with that and compost a lot of material using that. Then you also see there's a watering can, because the water is going to play a role. I have the smaller buckets in the wheelbarrow where I'm collecting materials. And even behind that bin, you can see there I have a pile that started. And that's going to be some of the rough organic matter that I'm going to be using to turn into compost. Here's another picture, and this shows that same type of fencing material. In this case, I filled it up with organic matter that I'm composting. So I'm going to let that break down within that fence. And also, you can, just because it's like this, it's easy to remove that fencing, to disconnect it, and then take it away. And that pile will stay in place. If you want it to just continue to compost, you can leave it standing, or you can remove that, and then you can turn the pile, as we'll talk about a little later. This slide is an example of like a community garden. A lot of community gardens, they do have compost systems where the community, the people, the gardeners that are working in that community garden, there'll be a place where they can take all their material that's compostable, and they'll just keep it in that area. And then they'll use that to make compost. So you can see there's one section, they have the sign where it says compost. And that looks more like that's finished compost. And then they have on the other side mulch, and then they probably have an area for just yard waste where they can bring the material that they're going to use to make the compost. This slide shows, and this is a larger scale, where a larger area, and this isn't when I'm composting. This is just where I'm gathering materials that I'm going to be using to compost. In this case, in the fall, I would get all of the leaves that had fallen, and in my area, they would take the leaves, and all the neighbors would rake the leaves out to the edge of their yard, and then they would come along, the municipality would come along, and they would vacuum up those leaves and take them away. And they did have a composting facility that they used, but I would go and I would collect, I would keep all the leaves that fell in my yard, and then my next door neighbors, I would get their leaves too, because I knew I could use those. I could turn that into compost. So I would save as many leaves as I could and save them over winter and then use them in the spring. Here's another type of setup. You can just use something similar like this, some type of little fencing. You can see this is a much larger area, and you could use this to make your compost, or there are ways people use pallets, and they have a similar setup. And I'm about to make one of those where I am now, where I'm using pallets, and I'm going to have maybe three separate sections where I could turn compost from one section to the other. And that way it gives you just a lot of area that you can use for making your compost. So now we're going to go into the composting techniques, and there are a number of them that we're going to look at today. The first one is called pit composting. And this is pretty simple. It's basically you're going to dig a pit or a trench, and this is just going to be like a trench, maybe a foot to 2 feet deep, and you're just going to dig this whatever length you need. And then after you dig the trench, you're going to add organic matter. So if you had grass clippings, or if you had kitchen scraps, or if you had leaves, you could just dump them into the bottom of the trench that you had dug, and you would keep adding that material into the trench. And then once you got it to the level where you wanted it, and maybe you would only put like 6 to 8 inches worth of organic matter in yard waste, kitchen scraps. And then after that, you would fill it up with soil the rest of the way. And then that's it. You would just leave it like that. You're going to leave that material in the ground, and it's going to decompose, and it's going to enrich the soil. But this is a slow process. So if you do that, you would just leave it, simple, not much effort other than create digging the trench and then adding materials. Once you do that, you're done. You don't have to do anything else. There's no turning, there's no collecting, gathering the finished compost. You just leave it in place. And it might take a year. It's a longer process. And you're only benefiting that specific area where you buried that waste. But it will break down, it'll add nutrition, it'll add, the soil organisms, the soil life, it'll add those to that area. So typically you might do this right in your garden area or an area where you plan on growing plants in the future, but maybe you're not doing it now, and you have some time to just let it sit and wait till that's broken down. And let's say after a year, then you go back and you would plant in that area, and then you'd have that fertile soil or composted area underneath at the bottom of that trench. So that's pit composting. Now, the next type of composting, I just labeled this cold composting in piles or bins. And I just used cold because that's going to help you to differentiate between. Next, we're going to be looking at a hot composting process. So, but they're real similar, the two methods. So for the cold composting, you're going to start by building your compost piles. And you're going to make them in layers. And at the bottom layer, you might put down a little bed of sticks or twigs. You're just going to lay them on the ground. And the purpose of the sticks are just an area where you can get some airflow underneath. It's not going to compact down as much, and you will be able to get some airflow underneath where those sticks are. Then you're going to start building your layers, and you're going to alternate between layers of green matter, which are going to be your nitrogen layers, and layers of brown matter, which are going to be your carbon. So the green matter would be things like your grass clippings. It would be things like if you pulled out your tomato vines, or you pulled out plants from your garden that were still green, and that would make up the green matter. Certain things like if you had pepper plants, for example, you might want to chop them up. You could put them in whole just as they are, but if you do that, it's going to take longer for them to break down. It's definitely better to use like a machete just to chop it up a little bit. Some things people will just run over with a lawnmower to help chop it up, or put it through a chipper shredder. And things like grass clippings, if you cut the grass and you collect them in a bagger, then you could use it as just like that. You don't want it to be clumped and matted together, but you could use that as your green matter. Then so you would put like maybe a layer of 4 to 6 inches of the green material. And then on top of that, you would put a layer of your brown material. And your brown material would be things like dried leaves, just something that's going to be brown. It's going to be dead. It's going to be dried. So that's what you're going to would be make up your brown matter. And typically you would use 2 parts of the green matter, or no, you use 1 part of the green matter and then 2 parts of the brown matter. So if you put 4 inches of green material, then you would want to use the 8 inches of your brown, your leaves, or your just wood chips. You can even use certain things like wood chips, a smaller amount, but you can use them as part of your compost. And again, if you can get things that are smaller pieces, that's going to help your compost to break down quicker. And then once you have that one green layer and then a brown layer, then you're going to come back with another green layer. another 4 inches of grass clippings or shredded yard waste and kitchen scraps. That would also count as green matter, things that are still not dried. They're just like fresh material and whatever organic matter. There's so many other things like straw would be another item that would be qualified or be classified as your brown matter. So there's just so many things that you can use. As long as it's organic, you can use it. Certain things you don't want to use, like you don't want to use meat, you don't want to use bones, things like that in your compost. Then the next thing that you do want to have as part of your compost pile, you want moisture in there. If it's just totally dry, it's really not going to break down, or it's going to break down like really slowly. So you want that pile, especially when you first build it, you want it to be moist. You want it to have some moisture content to it. And but you don't want it to be soaking wet. So the proper amount of content would be if you took like a handful and you squeezed it. If you can barely get some drops of moisture coming out off of that material, that would be about the correct amount of moisture that you want in there. If you squeeze it and there's nothing, there's no moisture, no moisture or no um, drips at all, then you can just take a hose or take a watering can and use that to apply to soak that to get some moisture content in your pile. One thing, if possible, you want to avoid like city water, water that's been chlorinated. Um, but if that's the only option that you have, then go on and use it. It's just that that can interfere with some of the microorganisms that you want to get established within your pile. But it will work even if you're using city water. If you have to use that, you're still going to be able to make compost and get the proper amount of soil life in that. It's just might again, it might take a little longer. Or you can, other thing is you could let the water sit before you apply it, let it sit a little while. There you can also see it mentions an accelerator, and that you can get commercial accelerators. These are just things that have soil life that you can buy and add that, and that's just to give it a boost and help speed the composting process. Another option would be if you have some compost that you made prior, you can get a couple handfuls of that. And all this is doing is getting those microorganisms and getting a base of that and adding that to help kind of inoculate that pile and get it started, get that activity started. So your options are to use some compost. You can also even use if you have some like decent soil, you can use that because that's going to have microorganisms in that soil. So you can use that as well. Or you can purchase some accelerator. They typically will call it compost starter. You can find it at a lot of online or at some of the nursery centers. Then once you have this done, you're going to just let that pile sit and decompose. And I refer to this as a cold method because it's still going to this that pile is going to heat up. It's still going to heat up, but it's just not going to get to the same degree of temperature and heat as what we're going to be talking about in the next section. So you do need the proper balance of size, air, and moisture for this to work. And the more size, the more you're going to be generating heat within that pile. And we're going to see that next when we discuss the hot composting. So this is slower, and the finished compost is not it's not going to be as high quality as if you did the hot composting, but you're still going to have compost. It's still going to be good. It's still going to be something that you can use to feed your plants to improve the growth and health of your garden. So that's the cold composting, and now we're going to talk about hot composting. So the process is very similar, especially starting out, you're going to be doing the same thing as far as the layers. You're going to alternate between green material and your brown material. But one thing that's going to be a little different is you want to have more mass. You want to have a bigger pile if you're doing the hot composting, because that additional mass is going to cause that to heat up better and heat up faster than it would if you were just doing like a small, like in one of those the black composting bin that I showed you earlier. That is still going to heat up, but it's just not going to give you as much as an effect as if you're doing a larger pile with more substance to it. So once you have, again, you have your pile, it's the same way. It has you have your green layers, your brown layers, you have your compost accelerator. You've done all that, and you've built this pile. And here is where we want to start monitoring the core temperatures. That's going to be the temperature towards the center of the compost pile. And they do have thermometers that you can use for this. They're ground thermometers. You can get them on eBay or Amazon. They're not that expensive, but they just have a long probe, kind of like a meat thermometer, but they're longer. It might be 3 foot long, the metal part that you stick within the compost pile, and it will reach down into the center of the pile and it'll register the temperature at that point. So you want to let your pile sit until the temperature rises to between 100 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So and it won't take long, depending on your ingredients and the size of your pile and the type of accelerator that you've used. It could only take like a couple of days, or it could take a day for it to reach that temperature. And when it gets to that point, then you want to turn the compost. The other thing you want to make sure that that core temperature doesn't go over 160 degrees Fahrenheit, because once it reaches that temperature, it gets that high, it's going to start destroying some of the beneficial microorganisms that you want to be in there. And it also is going to start promoting some of the unhealthy microorganisms that you don't want in your compost pile. So you want to be pretty precise with that temperature. You want to go, you want to monitor it, you want to check it. And if you don't have a thermometer, you can't even use, just reach into the center of that compost pile and feel the temperature. The compost, it will heat up to the point where it would definitely be uncomfortable to stick your hand in there. Another thing, sometimes you can just tell, you'll see that the steam rising from the compost pile. That's something else that you can use to kind of give you an idea of when it's time to turn that pile. Then for turning the compost pile, you actually want to move every bit of that pile. So to turn it, like if you had this in one of the wire fencing material, if that's what you were using to hold your compost, then you would want to have, you could either remove that, unwrap it, and then reconnect it and set it right next to the compost pile, and then turn the compost, your existing compost pile, just turn that into the same space. Or you could just have two piles and have, turn it from where it is to right next to it. And when you're turning the compost, the parts of the compost pile that are, hold on, excuse me, the parts of the compost pile that are towards the outside of that pile, you want to, when you're turning it, you want to make sure that those then become towards the interior of the pile. And then what's the current center of the pile, that's what you want to be on the outside of the pile once you're done. And I hope I'm making this clear, but if not, I can explain this more toward when we get to the question and answer session. So one of the advantages of the hot composting is that, this is really quick. I mean, you can go from, in a couple of weeks, you can go from having your organic matter to having really finished compost that's ready to apply, ready to use in your garden in, just 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, versus if you were doing the cold composting, that could take months before you actually had finished compost that was ready for the garden. Also, with the hot method, you don't have to worry as much about chopping the materials. You can use bigger pieces of organic matter. You can include more things like wood chips, because and surprisingly, even things like wood chips, those will break down. You would think that they're going to be hard, that it will take them a long time to break down, but they will break down really quickly as well. So now the next thing that we're going to talk about, this is another method of composting, and it's called vermiculture. And vermiculture is basically you're using worms to break down your organic matter and turn it into compost. Now we're not going to, excuse me, we're not going to go too deep into this. This could be a whole, presentation on itself, vermiculture, but it's becoming like one of my favorite ways to make compost because it's easy to do. You can do it on a small scale. You can do it indoors in your house, in your basement. or just a spare space that you have within the house. And it is pretty relatively quick to compost. And you really get really high quality compost when you're done. Because the earthworms, they're working that material. And there are a variety of types of worms that you can use. Everybody's familiar with like night crawlers, the earthworms that you find just typically out in the backyard. And you can use them, but they're not as good at composting as some other varieties, like the red wigglers. That's a common composting worm. They're smaller and they are reddish colored, and they just are really very active in taking organic matter and turning it into not compost per se, but they call it worm castings, which are basically worm poop. That's what the end product that you get when you're doing the vermiculture. So the things that are involved are you're going to get your worms that you're going to be using, and then the next step would be to set up your worm bin in the bedding. Your bedding is going to be the material that's using that the worms are nesting in. And again, this is going to be organic material. You want it to be something that's free of chemicals or any type of pollutants. Some of the things that are used are the coconut core, that coconut fiber that's really good for using for bedding. It's just going to be like the base that the worms are using. And they will use that. They will be eating and decomposing that. Or newspaper, like shredded newspaper or shredded cardboard, those are other things that people use as a base for the worms to nest in. And then on top of that, you're going to be adding your organic matter. Typically, with a worm bin, you're going to be using kitchen scraps, food waste. That's going to be what you're going to be feeding them. And there's almost anything that you have in the kitchen, you can feed to their worm. There are some exceptions, like you don't want to give them onions and garlic. You don't want to give them citrus fruits, and you don't want to give them hard like a avocado pit. You wouldn't want that to go in your worm bin. But aside from that, most things that the worms can handle, they will break down, and they'll use that to turn into the worm castings. Then once you have it set up and the worms are at home, they've turned that space into their home, the only thing left for you to do is to feed them. And you do have to feed them on a regular basis. You can keep track. You can go and you can look and see. You don't want to overfeed them, but you don't want them to be running out of food either. And so that's just something that you'll get a feel for it over time, how much you need to feed them, how much they can eat, and how often you need to feed them. And then the final step with vermiculture is just to harvest the worm castings. And there are different ways that you can harvest the worm castings. One way would be just to dump everything out, like on a sheet, a plastic sheet or something, and then put a light over top of it. And when that light will make the worms go towards the center of the worm castings and everything that's in the bin, and you can just kind of brush off the outside, and they'll continue to go to the center, and you can brush away the castings and set them aside. And then eventually you're going to get down to where you're just going to have mainly nothing but a mass of worms left. And that's what you can then take those and put them in back in your bin with some fresh bedding, whether it's the shredded newspaper or the coconut core, and then just start the whole process over again. And some people are concerned, they think, oh, well, if I have a worm bin in the house somewhere, the worms are going to escape. They're going to get away and they'll be all over the place. And typically they don't, unless something is wrong with your bin, like if it's over, um if there's too much moisture, just something that they're not comfortable with, yeah, then they could decide, okay, we're getting out of here. But for the most part, once they realize, okay, this is our home, they'll stay in there. Something that you can do to ensure, especially if you're just getting started, this a new setup, you can put a light over top of it and just leave a small light, just something real small, and leave that on, and that will prevent them from coming up. And at the top where your bedding is, you would use like a piece of cardboard or something that you could just have sitting on top, and you can remove that. You can feed them, and then you put that back on top. So that's the basic process for vermiculture. It's very simple, easy, and it's an effective way to compost, especially if you're doing this indoors. So this slide, it shows there that's a tote, and those are like worm castings. It's that's something that you can use as your bin. There are commercial bins that you can buy for worm composting. Some of them have different levels, but I've gotten to where I just, I don't use those. I have one, but I have a couple, but I don't even use them. I just use plain totes, something like that, or even smaller, or you can use larger. And on the left side here, you can see there's another, it's a clear tote, and that's also is smaller than the blue ones we just looked at, but that works fine as well. In the bags at the on the bottom left side, that's how if you order worms, a lot of times they'll come in a bag like that, and it'll just be a bag with some bedding and worms, and you can start. Usually, when you order, they'll ask you about the quantity, like if you want a pound or if you want 2 pounds. That's how they sell them. But even if you get like a pound, that's plenty to start with. On the upper right side, you can just see that's like some of the worms that what they look like. The red wigglers, they don't look that much different than earthworms, but they are. If you're familiar, you can tell the differences. And over time, you'll see things like the worms will multiply. You'll be start to see smaller size worms in there. You'll see the egg cocoons where they will be laying eggs, and each cocoon might hatch out a dozen, real small, tiny worms. So you'll start to see things like that because if you have a healthy bin, in addition to making the castings, the worms will be multiplying. Some people will turn this into a business. They'll be selling, earthworms for fishing. On the lower right side, that's just like a styrofoam. I found that those make really good worm bins also because for one thing, they're kind of temperature controlled. They hold the maintain a steady temperature. This one you can see it has holes in it all over the sides and the bottom. You really don't need holes. And now I've stopped putting holes in all of my bins. I just leave them without holes. You do want to make sure that it's not like you don't have a lid on it that's sealing it because that would prevent air from getting to the worms. Here's a picture, just, I'm gathering wood chips to use for making compost with. So that's one thing that you want to think about. And whatever you have available to you as a source of organic material, you want to collect that, gather it, whether it's wood chips, leaves, if you have a lot of trees in your area, even if you're in a neighborhood, you're not out in a rural area. If you have trees, there are leaves there that you can gather. If you have a yard, you have grass that you're cutting, you can use grass clippings. So there are lots of options, and you just have to look and see what will work best for you, where you can get some organic matter without having to pay or spend a lot of money for it. Even things like sawdust or coffee grounds, you can do things like go to a coffee shop and ask them, hey, can I get your coffee grounds? Because they go through tons of coffee grounds, and a lot of them, gladly let you take the coffee grounds away. But here on the left side, those are just some of the things that come in handy when you're collecting your organic matter. Just simple things, a rake, a trash can, a leaf blower. All these just come in handy when especially in the fall or at the end of the growing season, when your garden is dying back. You can just be gathering materials. On the right side, the upper right, that's again is that fencing material that I use to create a bin for my compost. And on the lower right side, you can see it's the same bin, but I've covered it with a tarp. And I'm doing that because once you don't want your bin to get flooded, to get like totally saturated. Like if you have it, and especially once it's gotten to the point where your compost is close to being finished, you don't want it to just get saturated because that can leach out some of the nutrients. It can also slow the breakdown. So you can use something like a tarp or just something to cover to keep the water, the rainfall from saturating the pile. If you were using like a bin with the pallets or with some type of sides. You could just have, maybe a piece of plywood or something that you can put over the top just so that it would shed water. Using your finished compost, there are different ways that you can use the compost, but it's, you've done the hard work just making the compost. Though using it is really pretty easy, pretty simple. I mentioned earlier that compost is very concentrated and a little goes a long way. You don't need to have like some people think they need to just pile up, 6 inches of mulch compost or 4 inches of compost on top of their garden. It only takes a couple of inches, at the most just to get the benefit of applying the compost. And you can just spread it over the garden and then scratch it into the top layers of the soil. You don't want to really bury the compost. You just want to apply it. And really, you're not applying compost. You're applying those soil organisms. There's going to be life in that soil. There's going to be all kinds of, creatures and microorganisms that are all throughout that. So that's what you're doing. You're inoculating your garden, your soil with that life form. You can also broadcast or use it to side dress plants. So when I say broadcast, just like if you're scattering grass seed, you can scatter compost that same way, kind of like dust. And it doesn't matter if it lands on top of plants. It's still that's fine. Again, you're spreading the microorganisms. And you're using that material is just going to be what's the carrier that's carrying those microorganisms to your plants, to your garden. And as far as side dressing, that would just involve just scattering some along the sides of established plants. Potting soils, if you're buying potting soils or planting mixes to use in the garden or to use in containers, you can mix some compost in with that. Again, even if you had like a 10-gallon pot that you're going to be using to grow something, even just a handful of compost would be really good, would be adequate to use on a container that size. You can also make your own compost teas and apply them as a foliar spray. And all this is you're going to be taking your compost. Some will get like a little sachet, one of the little I'm not even sure what they call them, but sometimes people use it for tea or for like herbs if they're cooking something that you can put your herbs in. But it's just something that's similar to that concept. Find something that will you can put some type of mesh bag and put some compost in there, and then just suspend it in a bucket of water. That's going to help, turn that into tea. And there is a process to really get high quality compost teas, and that would involve, in addition to adding that your finished compost, you would also add something to feed it, like some trying to think, a lot of times people use not manures, but fish emulsion. That's something that people will use to help feed it, and things like molasses. And they'll put that in the bucket with the compost, and they'll even get like a bubbler, one of the air stones, and connect that to a pump and pump aerate that water. So now you're getting oxygen into that mix, and you're getting that's also stirring it and giving it some activity. And that if you do that, those soil organisms are just gonna, blossom. They're gonna bloom. They're just gonna grow at a really amazing rate that you will get a lot more making the tea like that. And then the tea you could put it in a watering can and sprinkle it on your plants or your garden, or you could use a sprayer and use that to apply the foliar compost teas. I mentioned earlier about fruit trees, how you can just use it as a mulch, a couple of inches in a circle around the base of your fruit trees. If you want to use it in your lawn, you could just take handfuls and just, scatter it, broadcast it, as we talked about before. You can use that to feed your lawns as well. Here in this photo, you could just be going through in between the plants and the rows, and you could lay down compost in between established plants like that, and it's going to help with the growth and the health of those plants. And then even just that's also going to improve the structure of your soil. Compost is just amazing the way that it can improve the structure of the soil, and even the if you went from something like a or just a really poor soil, there was not much life and not much vitality in that soil, just adding compost, that can change that. That can improve your soil more than you would imagine. If you have new beds, you can just incorporate compost as part of that mix. You wouldn't want to do a bed with 100% compost. Most plants don't grow well in just nothing but compost. Compost isn't intended to be something that you're just planting in at full strength, just nothing but compost. It's an addition to your topsoil, but it would do well to help with new plantings, or if you need to refresh existing planting beds. And there's a sprayer I mentioned about the compost teas. You could use something like this. And when you're spraying the teas, you can spray it on the leaves of the plants. You can spray it on the soil because you're what you're doing, as I mentioned before, you're applying those microorganisms. That's what you're trying to get. So now some additional tips about related to composting. One thing that some people do is they incorporate chickens into their composting process. If you have chickens, if you're raising chickens, some people, I think, they keep chickens not even for meat or for eggs, but they raise chickens just because of the benefits that they provide to the garden. Just having chickens, they can help break down that matter. They can peck at stuff. They can eat the weed seeds that are in there. They can eat some of the insects and bugs that might be getting into the compost. And then they also add the chicken manure, which will then you can use that as well as an accelerator to help those piles to break down. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that with your materials, when you're building your piles, if you're doing the hot composting, you can get away with things like weed seeds. If you're doing it properly, that temperature can destroy the weed seeds. So it's not as much of an issue. But just in general, when you're making your compost pile, you don't want to use weed seeds. If you have some weeds or some plants that have already started to go to seed, you want to either don't use them or cut the seeds off and don't get them in your compost because then you don't want to be making compost that's really just going to be spreading weeds throughout your garden. Also, with disease, if you have diseased plants, like you had a crop of tomatoes or peppers that had some type of s disease, fungus or something, you wouldn't want to use that material in your compost. Get rid of that and just use healthy material that when you're making your compost. Again, the hot composting process does have the ability to help destroy some of those things, but you're better to be on the safe side. Some people, certain crops, they'll grow them right in the compost pile or the bin. If you've done any composting in the past, you may have noticed that there are certain things like maybe sometimes a tomato plant, more often things like squash and pumpkins. Or I noticed that even things like kale, they seem to be able to grow and survive and volunteer and grow right in compost and do fine. Be cautious with commercial and municipal compost. Some of it's okay, but some of it, there are things that can be an issue or cause you a problem down the road. For one thing, with the commercial and municipal compost, there can be, depending on where I used to live in Pennsylvania, that we had a municipal composting recycling center, and they would take, the leaves and things and um, yard waste and wood trimmings. They would take those and they would break them down and they would turn it into compost. But some of the issues are if they're using something that has some type of chemical or contamination, even grass clippings. If someone's been, treating their lawns, and that can be an issue that can cause you a problem. So you want to be aware of that. Another thing with the municipal and commercial compost and even other products of topsoil, they'll pile that up, the finished material. They'll just have it in a pile, exposed to the weather, exposed to weeds. And, I've seen some that were just totally covered with weeds. And that's going to be, again, that will be putting weed seed in that material. And then if you got that and use it on your garden, then you're going to be sprouting those same weeds down the road. So just beware. Another issue that I had with some of the municipal compost was just that there was sometimes there would be trash in there, and whether it was plastic bottles or paper, just mixed in with some of the compost things that wouldn't break down. Yeah, paper would break down, but other plastics, they're not going to break down in compost, and you would be getting some of that material as well. The next point, look out for contaminated organic matter. That's like I mentioned about things like fungicides or herbicides that have been applied to plants or gardens or lawns. There's certain ones that are persistent. They remain even after being composted. They will still be there, and they can then down the road affect the growth of the plants in your garden, and you want to avoid them. That's why I'm really particular about the compost that I use. And the other thing is, you can use manures. You can use like things like cow manures, or if you have goats or chickens, you can use them as an accelerator, as a small percentage portion of your compost, and that will help that pile to heat up. It'll help it to break down quicker. But you also want to make sure that if you're doing that, that you're using, manures from healthy animals and not animals that have been treated with different types of, chemical um, things for health or whatever. You want to just be aware and consider that if you're using manures. I mentioned before we talked about, looking for free sources of organic matter to compost rather than, because you don't want to be buying stuff to use. So, I mean, some people will buy things like straw to use and turn that into compost, but that kind of defeats the purpose. You're better off to just to find something that you can get at no cost. In most places, there is some type of organic matter that you'll be able to get and add that to what you have naturally on your property, whether it's your grass clippings or your yard waste, your kitchen scraps. So because a lot of times you're going to need more organic matter than what you just have from unless you're, really farming or something, and that might be different. And here, that next bullet point, it says advanced skills microscopy for microorganism identification. And this is something that if you really get into composting, it's a good skill to have because if you have a microscope, you can learn to identify the microorganisms. And it's just fascinating to be able to look and see. You take a couple of teaspoons of compost or a couple of teaspoons of your soil and add a little water and shake it in a tube and then just take one drop of that out and put it on a slide. You just be amazed at how much life, how much activity and the different things that are just going to be in that drop, one single drop of water. And there are going to be things, some that are small bacteria. You're going to see some that are long strands of fungi. You're going to see other things that are just like individual organisms that kind of look like, maybe kind of like a dragon or something. It's just that's the kind of, life that you'll see on that slide that's contained in your compost, that's contained in your soil. And it's just interesting to be able to see those things. And also, that's one way that that skill will allow you to identify the things that are beneficial and the things that are not beneficial that you don't want in your compost and that are a sign that you've done something wrong. Like for example, that you let your piles become anaerobic rather than aerobic. So it gives you that ability to do those types of things, just having that those skills of how knowing how to use a microscope and how to identify different types of organisms. Here's a picture. This was on my property. Every time they do clear the lines for the electric power lines for the trees, I always tell them, hey, you can come back because they're looking for places to drop off wood chips. And wood chips are just so valuable, not just for compost, but I use them for lots of other things. I use them for mushroom production. I use them for mulch. I use them for compost. So, and I'll take all of the wood chips I can get anytime. One of the things I mentioned about that you can grow on right on your compost pile, pumpkins. That's a example. And we talked about being cautious of pesticides and herbicides in the organic matter that you're using to mulch or to turn into compost. Here's the company. This was the previous summer where they were dropping off loads of wood chips here. And here are a few books that you can use or you can check out. That first one, Teeming with Microbes. In these books, none of these are really about just composting, but they're more along informational just in terms of your soil in general, the life that's within the soil. Like that first one, Teeming with Microbes, it's just all about the microbial activity that's within the soil and how important those microbes are. The next one, building soils naturally. Then there's one, start with the soil. And that last book is called Worms Eat My Garbage, and that's about vermiculture. So and there are also some good books out there that do focus on composting and processes and how to make your own compost. So you can find these. I've also there are workshops that you can go. Some of them might be like half a day, or some of them are more intensive workshops where you can learn skills about how to make your own compost or how to do things like the compost teas. Um, I've studied when I was in Pennsylvania. I lived not far from Rodale Institute, and when I was there, Elaine Ingham, she's like a well-known soil scientist, and she was there. She was based out of Rodale when I was in that area, so I did a lot of courses with her, everything from composting to the worm composting and the compost teas and the microscopy. So that was really, interesting. And you can find courses like that. Some of them are even where you can learn things like that online. Just as far as closing thoughts, we started out looking at the scripture about, in the Garden of Eden, where God created Adam from the dust of the earth. And, my question, something that I think about is, how much of that dust, the same things that, God created Adam when are part of us now. We know we have microorganisms and that they make up the biggest part of our bodies, we talk about things like the microbiome. So it's just kind of fascinating for me just to think about how that works and the ties that there are between that in our gardens and our health, our immune system. All of that plays a role in it, and it was there from the beginning, from when God made us. The dust, we were made of the earth. And so therefore I know we were made of these microorganisms that we now use for things like composting. And there's just so many other things that those microorganisms play a role in that we don't even realize. There are these things that we can't even see with the naked eye. We have to have a microscope to even see them and to really think about how much the numbers of these that are contained within our bodies or just on our skin. And certain things like, people are into things like grounding and walking on the earth barefoot and gardening and even simple things like getting our hands into the earth. Does that give us that contact that we need with these additional microorganisms, and how people are aware now that when our children, if we don't expose them to these microorganisms, and if they're in a sterile environment and don't have that, even coming out of the birth canal, if they're not exposed to those microorganisms, it has a negative effect on their health. So these are all things that I just, think about and wonder about. And, just it's just so much there for us to consider and to learn. And this is as far as the composting, this is our objective. One of the goals is to, be able to produce, you know, plentiful food and produce that's going to be healthy. It's going to be nutritious. It's going to make our lives better, improve our health. It's going to be for the health of our families and for our enjoyment, our pleasure, to be able to grow more productive gardens in a variety of produce that has higher nutritional qualities and better flavors. This is something that well-grown produce and healthy soil gives us all of these things. And it's just so much out there, so much, as far as the gardening and the variety that's available to us that we can take advantage of. And now I'm going to hand it back over to our moderators. And before I do, I also just wanted to share that some of the things that I'm doing now at my property, and I'm in West Virginia, I do workshops at my property. I have some online courses that I have set up that you can, find out more about if you go to coregardening.com. There's a lot of information there. But I also do some presentations and speak at some conferences. I'm going to be speaking in Texas in January at the AdAgra conference. I also I do farm stays and things like that right here on my property in West Virginia. And this is something that if you want to go You want to spend, even if you just want to spend time in the country, if that you want to get some experience, if you're not familiar with country living, just for a vacation, a getaway, where you can just have some quiet time in peace and rest and relaxation, you can come here and all of that's available. Here's a list of some of the things that I provide trainings and workshops and coaching on, things like country living, farming and food production, beekeeping and vermiculture, which we covered a little bit here today, seed saving, nature awareness, food preservation, off-grid systems, and that last bullet point, foraging for wild edible plants and medicinal herbs. Those are all types of things that I do teach and share with others. And here's my contact information. My website is coregardening.com. And you can see my phone number and my email address. There's kenny.point@gmail.com. And now I will hand it back over to Sister Nicole.
Thank you, Brother Kenny. It was very informative and I learned a lot of things because I thought compost was a fertilizer. So I learned a lot. So we'll open the floor for any question. Anyone have any question, you can raise your hand or you can unmute and go ahead.
Were there any?
I have a question, Brother Kenny. What
Yes.
impact of using not cow, horse manure? I hear that it's not recommended. So what's your take on it?
It goes back to when I was mentioning about knowing the source, knowing, the horses that you're getting that manure from. Are they like just horse treating those horses with? Are they taking any, like chemical being treated with anything that could be carried over into the manure and then passed on to your garden? And if you are any type of manure, even if it's a high quality, good manure, it's not an issue with it being contaminated or having chemicals in the manure itself, it's still a good idea to me if you're going to use it to compost it. Where in the past, people would just spread it and then wait, give it some time to age a little bit. But I think it's much better to compost that horse manure or cow manure or even chicken, rat, whatever it is. I think it's better to compost it first.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Go
I
ahead.
I am an amateur gardener. I live in Central Florida, and most of the land in Central Florida, you probably know, is very sandy. But where I live is maybe a mile or two from a pretty big lake, so I don't have sandy soil. My soil type is a lot better. So I've been planting sweet potatoes. But what I've been doing is putting the kitchen scraps directly into the garden bed, into the area. And what I noticed is the first year I got sweet potatoes without any problems, but this year the sweet potatoes were bitten on by, I don't know what kind of insect was biting them, chewing on them. So I wondered if it was a bad idea to put scraps directly into the soil where I'm going to plant, if that is what is attracting the pests that are eating the sweet potatoes.
Yeah, I would say that yeah, I wouldn't put it directly in the area where I'm growing unless I was putting it in advance of when I'm planting and growing it, or putting that in the ground, but then you're giving it time to break down and decompose rather than having your crops growing in that space at the same time. So I don't know if that's because it could attract different animals which would be an issue. It sounds like your issue is more with probably insects. I don't know if that's what's causing the problem that you were having. And I typically don't see many things going after my sweet potatoes other than things like, rabbits or deers, they will. But I don't really see many insects that bother my sweet potatoes.
Right. Well, I don't have rabbits or deer, so whatever it is, it's going on underground. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and even if you didn't have you weren't putting your kitchen scrap, it could still be an issue with things that are in the soil if it's something there. Because yeah, that's something that could be a problem, and it's really not related to the fact that you put those scraps in
Okay.
there. It's just something that's in the soil, and it's going
Yeah, I
after
have a
the
quick
sweet potato
question,
roots
follow-up
themselves.
question. Um,
Hmm.
Now, just let me gather my thoughts. Just give me a minute. I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. It was a question about what else. Oh, here's a question.
Mhm.
Someone told me that if I put wood ash and azomite and turn over the soil and keep the wood ash and azomite within the soil, that would chase away the insects that are eating the potatoes. Wood
Yeah,
ash and azomite. Is that true?
I wouldn't agree with that. And for one thing, I'd be careful with the wood ash because you can't overdo it by applying wood ash to the soil. And if that happens, then that's going to be like a long-term problem. So, because wood ash does add certain specific ingredients to the soil that you don't want a high level of, and you can easily and quickly get too high with wood ash. And I don't recall if it's potassium or exactly what it for the amount that you do apply to the soil. And then I don't think that that would necessarily be a guarantee that just using that combination would be guaranteed to keep away certain insects. Because yeah, I wouldn't say that, and I don't know how, you could prove that that was the case.
Okay,
So
thank you.
I'd be less concerned with the azomite, but even that, you don't want to go overboard with anything, but definitely not the wood ash. You want to be careful with the amount of wood ash that you put on your
Okay.
soil.
Sister Magali, I'm hoping I'm not pronouncing
No,
your
you
name
got it
properly.
right. You got it right. Thank you. Good night. Thank you,
Hello.
Brother Point, for such a wonderful presentation. And I am new, just getting my hands dirtied in the soil. And composting is something I always wanted to try to stay away from commercial fertilizers and so on. But I never had the grasp of it as to exactly what to do with it. So your presentation tonight was very beneficial. While scrolling on YouTube, though, I saw something very interesting and I say, wow, is that easy? Maybe I could try that. In the bin, they cut a bottle and put scraps from the kitchen, lettuce and tomatoes and whatever, with a little water and got that covered. So it would sip in the bin. To me, I found it fascinating and I was saying, wow, that's something maybe I could try in my garden, but I'm not sure how safe it is, how if that is a good way of composting. I'm not sure. In a 5 stuff whatever in, you give it some water and you cover it. I'm
Okay.
not sure if that is a good
Hmm.
idea.
Yeah, see, to me, I don't think that and you have to be careful sometimes with stuff that you see on
Yes,
the
definitely.
internet. They'll be putting things saying you can do this or that and coming up with these ideas that don't necessarily work. And that's something that, to me, logically, it doesn't make sense because if you're putting the scraps in the bottle like that and then adding water, the scraps that are in there really aren't breaking down, which is what you want to do. And one thing I really didn't cover much during the presentation, but the other thing with the kind of bins that you can rotate and spin and mix in compost like that, even those, it's an issue because typically when you start your compost, you want to have all your materials, you want to build your pile, and then you don't want to continue adding fresh or new ingredients because then half of it would be broken down, and then what you're just adding needs to be broken down, and it's going to need time. And you're never going to get to the point where you would have finished compost. It would always be like a work in progress. And that kind of sounds the same, similar to me with the bottle. It's like you might get some nutrients leaching off of the materials in the bottle, but you're not getting that soil life, which is what you're really looking for. You're not trying to get nutrients from the material. You're trying to create that microorganisms, and you're not getting that at all. Because for one thing, just that water in itself, if it's sitting in the bottle, it's not going to permit those to grow. And if it's just running right out of the bottle, that's the organic matter or whatever you put the scraps in that bottle, they're just never going to
Yeah,
break
I
down. All
figured
you're
that
going to be
much.
like,
Thank you so
yeah,
much. And another question,
yes.
for the hot composting, is it possible?
No, because the temperature that you want is from the
Ah,
core of the pile. Like that picture where I showed you the picture that's down towards the center of the
okay,
pile. And
okay.
that's why you get the thermometers, they have like a long probe. It's like a long, just a metal
Mm-hmm.
that you stick in there, and then the thermometer is at the
Yeah.
end. So it reads the thermometer at the very tip, which is probably like 3 feet towards the center of the pile.
Okay. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
you're welcome. Were there any questions or comments in the chat, Sister
No, there
Nicole?
are none. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't see
Okay.
the hands up. So if you have any closing remarks, you can go ahead, and then I'm going to ask you to close out with prayer. And thank you again for coming on. It was a very informative presentation.
Okay. You're welcome. And just as far as now, I see a hand came up.
Hi, Brother Point.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Lewis.
Hi, how are you?
I want to ask a question when it compose, because I do compose, but I never check the temperature.
Mhm.
So is it important to check the temperature? Because I have a container
Mhm.
and I just throw all my waste, then I just move the container ever so often. Important to
Right.
check the temperature?
Not necessarily. If you're trying to get like by the book, yeah, you would want to check the temperature, but you also would be building it a certain way. If you're just making piles, you can do it that way. That's more like you're doing the cold composting, which is fine, and the material is still going to break down.
Yeah.
You're eventually going to wind up with compost. It's just going to take longer,
Oh,
and you might have as high levels of the soil microorganisms as you would if you were doing the hot composting and turning it. But you can do it the way that you're doing it. That will work as well.
okay. All
Okay.
right. Thank
Okay.
you.
You're welcome.
Mhm.
And just as far as closing remarks, the only thing I have would be to just, try and just compost, and if this is something that's new to you, I definitely recommend the vermicomposting. It takes a little bit more just to get the worms and you're dealing with something that's living. But other than that, I think it works really well in the earthworm castings. That's something that you can go and you can buy at the store. They sell earthworm castings, which you can add if you didn't want to make your own. But it's so easy to make your own, and you can make your own tea with the earthworm castings. That works really well. But composting is something that I feel like we should definitely be knowing, should be learning how to do because it's one of those things that we can't buy, we can't sell, we don't have access. If the costs go up as far as fertilizer is concerned, and the shortages with fertilizer, knowing how to make your own compost is just going to make you more self-sufficient, more independent of the systems. It's definitely something, God's given us that ability, capability to use this to make this material. So we should take advantage of that. So
For your
that,
prayer, I'll just ask anybody if they are interested in the recording, you can put your email in the chat.
okay. And let's close with prayer. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, for allowing us to gather together. Thank you for Sister Nicole. Thank you for everyone that's on the platform that's here watching the presentation and that will listen to the recordings. Please give us wisdom and understanding. Help us to see and to know to how to apply the things that you have set up for us, to discover and seek the things that are available for us that will help us to be healthy, to help our gardens to grow, to closer to you, knowing how you have provided for us, how you take care of us, and that nothing is too small or insignificant. And even some of the things that we can't even see, they are so important to us and they're an active part of your creation and of this world. We ask you to continue to guide us and draw us closer to you. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
And thank you.